It's really such a great privilege for me to introduce Iris Chang to you tonight. She will speak on her wonderful and important new book, The Chinese in America. And Iris Chang is the author of numerous books, including the international bestseller, The Rape of Nanking, which received great critical acclaim when it came out in 1997, describing the 1937 Japanese military siege of more than 300,000 Chinese civilians in the then capital city of China. In the course of her career, she's received numerous honors, including the John T. and Catherine D. MacArthur Foundation's Program on Peace and International Cooperation Award, and major grants from the National Science Foundation and the Pacific Cultural Foundation. In her new book, The Chinese in America, Iris Chang deftly weaves together richly documented research into a fascinating narrative that gives depth and voice to the diverse experiences of Chinese Americans. And her account takes us from the first arrivals of Chinese migrants in 19th century America, who were subsequently vilified, to the working and middle-class migrants who have arrived in the last few decades and been incorporated into American society, both welcomed and feared. Now, as some of you may know, I have both personal and professional reasons to be drawn to this work. I myself am the American-born child of Chinese immigrants to the U.S., the kind of pre-1965 wave of immigration. And in my own work, I focus on the American-born and raised children of immigrants from Asia and Latin America. But you don't have to be the child of immigrants. You don't have to have any kind of research interest in immigration and education to appreciate the insightful narrative history presented in The Chinese in America. As Iris Chang demonstrates very lucidly for us, the story of the Chinese is necessarily a story about other groups in America and really of America itself. And I would like you to join me in warmly welcoming her to the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. It's truly an honor and privilege for me to be speaking here at Harvard this evening. And what I would like to do is talk a little bit first about the rape of Nanking and then the Chinese in America. On the surface, two very different topics, and yet they both fall under the rubric of human rights. And I'd like to use these two topics as a way of exploring the racist causes of atrocity and mistreatment of civilians. And my plan is to first discuss Nanking, and then the Chinese experience in America, and then I would be very happy to take questions from the floor. First, let's start with Nanking. Back in 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army invaded the nation of China, and after months of street fighting, proceeded to lay siege to the city of Nanking, the Chinese capital. And on December 13th, 1937, the Japanese forces smashed through the walls of the defenseless city, and within weeks not only looted and burned Nanking, but systematically raped, tortured, and murdered hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians. And during the first few days of the massacre, the Japanese machine-gunned tens of thousands of men, buried them alive, used them for bayonet practice or decapitation contests, or sprayed them with gasoline and set them on fire. And then the Japanese turned their attention to the women, and the rape of Nanking, which was the rape of an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 women, was the single worst mass rape of World War II history and the second worst mass rape of world history. There was a degree of suffering that almost defies human imagination. Mothers watched their babies skewered on bayonets or tossed into vats of boiling waters. Fathers were often told to rape their own daughters. People were skinned alive, crucified, and even cannibalized. The violence was so brutal that even the Nazis in the city were shocked. And by the time it was all over, the death toll had reached an estimated 300,000 people by some estimates, greater than the toll of the atomic blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, and even surpassing in those first few weeks of hell the total combined casualty count of 3 European countries, England, France, and Belgium, for the entire duration of the war. I wish I could say that Nanking, which is the subject of my second book, was an isolated incident, but it was only a small fraction of Japan's crimes in the Pacific. The war ultimately killed some 19 to 35 million Chinese civilians and millions more across Asia, such as Filipinos, Southeast Asians, Asian Indians, and British and American POWs. And in secret laboratories such as Unit 731 in Manchuria, Japanese doctors would conduct medical atrocities on American and Chinese prisoners, such as vivisection without anesthesia. The Japanese government also forced hundreds of thousands of women, most of them Korean, to serve as sex slaves for the Imperial Army, from which only 1 in 4 women survived. And the reason I wrote this book was because it boggled my mind to try to grasp how ordinary human beings, many of them decent and law-abiding citizens, could commit such unspeakable acts. And to understand their behavior, I had to examine the role of racism in Japanese society and how many soldiers were inculcated for violence since childhood. And later I would see some parallels in the role of racist stereotypes in American society as well, and I will discuss this later. But to put the childhood of the Japanese soldier in the context of the times, you have to keep in mind that during the 1920s and the early 30s, Japanese society at large was reeling from a severe economic depression and political instability. And so when ultranationalists urged expansionism into China and even world domination to cure the nation's woes, people were willing to listen to them. And under their influence, Japan became an intensely militaristic culture, and in school, Japanese teachers would instill in young boys hatred and contempt for the Chinese people to prepare them psychologically for an invasion of the mainland. Just to give you an example of this, a historian wrote how a Japanese schoolboy in the 1930s burst into tears when he was ordered by his teacher to dissect a frog, and his teacher slapped him and said, "Why are you crying about one lousy frog? When you grow up, you'll have to kill 100, 200 chinks." And so there was this atmosphere of violence and pressure to conform to authority in school, and it only intensified when many of these schoolboys decided to become soldiers. And vicious hazing would squelch from these boys any residual spirit of individualism. And to give you examples, soldiers and older officers would beat up new recruits for no reason at all and force them to perform humiliating tasks, such as washing the underwear of superiors. So it was easy to see after a while how in such a brutal climate, how months of pent-up frustration would explode in uncontrollable violence in Nanking. For in this hierarchical system, the Japanese soldier had endured in silence whatever his superiors had chosen to deal out to him, and so it was natural for him to believe that the Chinese had to now take whatever he chose to deal out to them. And there was also, within the training of the Japanese soldier, a process of dehumanization, of training the mind to see the enemy as subhuman creatures, and many of the soldiers were ordered not to see the Chinese as human beings, but rather creatures of less value of a dog or a cat. And another aspect of the dehumanization was also the use of religion that taught the Japanese soldier that all human life was meaningless, including his own. I just want to bring this up to emphasize that Japanese life itself was also not exempt from this process of dehumanization. One soldier whom I interviewed had told me that he was taught to believe that the emperor was a force greater than God, and that loyalty in the army was heavier than a mountain, and his own life was as light as a feather. And so the greatest honor for him and other soldiers in war was to come home dead. And the reason I am discussing the rape of Nanking is because I want to point out that several landmarks were clearly present in this journey of race-driven mass murder and genocide. There was an economic recession. There was the rise of ultranationalism and political dictatorship, and also their exploitation of racial tensions, and there was also the process of dehumanization. And I believe that racism and xenophobia have always been potent forces in the history of the human race, but nothing brings it to the surface as quickly as a political or economic crisis. We see this in the history of the Jewish Holocaust and in the Armenian genocide, and also in Japan's invasion of China. And to a lesser degree, we also find examples of this in U.S. history, such as in the story of the Chinese in America. And when you read my book, you'll see how the United States, a country that prides itself as a bastion of fair play and justice, once shut the Chinese out entirely from the gates of immigration and from the law, and even turned a blind eye to the wholesale slaughter of Chinese Americans across the American West more than a century ago. There is a perception out there that the Chinese in America started out poor and downtrodden at the very bottom of society, only to rise steadily to the top, where they are now looked upon as model minorities. But the reality is that the Chinese, like other ethnic groups, would endure cycles of acceptance and abuse, wild swings between tolerance and xenophobia. At certain times in history, they were praised and celebrated as honorary whites, while at other times they were loathed and even killed. And their fate oscillated with factors beyond their control, such as economic and political conditions and the state of American diplomatic relations with China. If I may summarize these cycles briefly, we can look at the history of the Chinese in America as the story of three major immigrant waves in the last 150 years, each of which experienced great extremes of success and mistreatment. The first wave of Chinese immigrants, mostly men, came in the mid-19th century, the majority to join the California gold rush, although others migrated directly to other regions. And they were warmly welcomed when they first arrived, mainly because the U.S. needed their labor at the time, especially during the Civil War when there was a shortage of manpower. And as the Chinese filled this labor shortage, they made huge unheralded contributions to this country, such as building the Transcontinental Railroad, for which 3 Chinese died for every 2 miles of track laid. They transformed the western frontier into land for agriculture. It may also be news for some of you that at one point, almost 9 out of 10 farm workers in California were Chinese in the 19th century. They also labored in factories and canneries during the American Industrial Revolution, becoming so efficient that when a device was invented to replace manpower or actual human labor in some of the fish canneries, they called it the iron chink. And it might also come as a surprise to you that many of the early Chinese were actually accepted in the United States before their numbers grew too large to be perceived as a threat. On the East Coast, and especially in New York City, unions, marriages between Chinese men and Irish women were frequent enough to provoke articles in the press and caricatures on the stage. Yang Wing, the first Chinese-American graduate of a major American university, which was Yale University, married a Caucasian woman, as did many of his protégés in the Chinese Educational Mission, a 19th century program that Yang Wing oversaw, enabling more than 100 young Chinese men and boys to study at American high schools and colleges. And some Chinese even found acceptance in the most racist regions of the American South. Chang and Bunker, the famous Siamese twins who shared a liver and a 5-inch ligament of flesh connecting their torsos, settled down in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, where they married white women, fathered 21 children, and ran their own plantations, complete with 33 black slaves. Their 2 eldest sons enlisted in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. So if you were to try to trace the descendants of the earliest Chinese in the country, many, I am sure, would not even be recognizably Chinese. but the Chinese soon faced a backlash, especially in California. White Americans began to view them as a problem as the Chinese population grew, in particular during the economic depression of the 1870s, when white workers found it hard to compete effectively with Chinese capitalists and wage earners. And in desperation, white workers organized among themselves politically against Chinese immigrants. And the ethnic Chinese soon found themselves demonized in the media, the subject of racist state legislation, and also forced to pay more taxes and license fees than any other group in California, while also not being permitted to vote or use many government services such as hospitals that were sustained by their taxes. They couldn't testify against whites or work for a public corporation, and their children were the only group to be denied a state-funded education. Matters only grew worse for the Chinese when California became a crucial swing state during presidential elections, and political parties adopted anti-Chinese platforms to court the state of California. Washington officials at the time found it convenient to blame the nation's problems on the Chinese rather than to have the American public scrutinize their own corruption and acceptance of bribes and collusion with big industry, which was rampant at the time. And so in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would shut the gates of immigration to Chinese labor for the next 60 years. Other laws passed over the next few decades would lock the Chinese out of the country, even if they had property and families in the U.S., force them to register with the government for residential certificates, and deprive them of the protection of the courts and bail and habeas corpus cases, and threatened even the privileges associated with birthright citizenship. Anti-Chinese riots and massacres would also explode across small towns and cities across the American West, driving many of these Chinese out, and thousands left for China, never to return. This cycle of acceptance and abuse would be repeated for the Chinese in the 20th century during the second major wave of their immigration. The door to Chinese immigration opened up once again after the repeal of the exclusion laws following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led people in the United States to see the Chinese, and by extension the Chinese Americans, as the good guys during the Sino-American wartime alliance. And new legislation in the 1960s swept away the racist immigration quotas against Asian countries. Now, this second wave consisted largely of students and highly educated professionals, and represented one of the greatest brain drain waves of Chinese immigrant talent to America. Many of the newcomers were intellectuals, capitalists, or bureaucrats who had held prominent positions in the deposed nationalist regime and who were forced to leave after the communist takeover of 1949. A few went directly to the United States immediately, either before or after the 1949 revolution, but many more went to Hong Kong or Taiwan and later migrated to the United States, usually to study or to start new careers there. And then there was another group that consisted of college students and graduate students who happened to be studying at our institutions here when the Chinese Civil War left them stranded, and they chose to stay rather than to try to return to mainland China, because there would not have been a home for them there. But large-scale immigration from mainland China during this time ceased almost completely when the PRC isolated itself from the world community during the Mao Zedong years. So a lot of this immigration was being funneled through Hong Kong and Taiwan. And just like the first wave of immigration, this second wave was warmly welcomed at first. The Chinese came at a time when the United States needed and actively sought immigrant brain power as they entered the arms race against the Soviet Union. And the U.S. federal government poured billions of dollars into research and development, into sustaining our universities and national laboratories, especially after the Russian launch of Sputnik made Americans believe they were lagging behind in science and technology. And so the second wave of Chinese immigrants entered our universities, our corporations, and our defense laboratories, designing some of America's earliest rockets, developing powerful drugs and medicines, and fueling the high-tech and scientific revolution. And in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, their contributions helped establish and maintain U.S. supremacy in the information age. And some of these individuals have become extraordinarily successful, people such as I.M. Pei and Nobel laureates, CEOs, and pioneers in their fields. But I need to emphasize that it wasn't always smooth sailing for this group either. When the Korean War broke out, when white American troops clashed with communist Chinese forces, reports began to surface of the Chinese facing a backlash. In a time when white soldiers were now being slaughtered and imprisoned and tortured in POW camps in China, the Chinese in America were now increasingly being seen as the bad guys, just as the Japanese Americans had been a few years earlier. And soon some ethnic Chinese in this country would be physically attacked and their property vandalized. And at the same time, the Chinese Americans were accused of being communist sympathizers, of being supportive of the new PRC government, would find their mail opened and their phone lines tapped and their movements shadowed in the streets by the FBI. The U.S. government during this time even considered incarcerating the Chinese in concentration camps and allocated money to set up detention centers, although thankfully this proposal was never put into place. One person whose career in the U.S. was destroyed by the anti-Chinese hysteria was Xianhu Shen, a visionary Caltech professor of aerodynamics and the subject of my first book, Threat of the Silkworm. During World War II, Dr. Xian had worked on secret military projects, resulting in the production of some of America's first military missiles, and he was also one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. But during the McCarthy era of the 1950s, he was falsely accused of being a communist and possibly a spy, mainly because many of his friends at Caltech had belonged to a secret communist cell during the 1930s. It's questionable as to whether he really knew this was communist or not. Many people simply went just to enjoy the intellectual discussion and the music that was being played there. But unfortunately for Xian, the government didn't quite look upon it that way, and the accusation against him came at a time when the United States was entering one of its most paranoid eras in history. China had fallen to the communists. The Russians had successfully detonated their first atomic bomb, and evidence suggested that a British and American spy ring may have passed some of these atomic secrets to the Russians. And so the American government and the U.S. public began to believe that the country was just infested with spies. And so after 5 years of investigation and virtual house arrest for Dr. Xian in Pasadena, during which time, by the way, the U.S. government did not find a scrap of evidence that Xian was either a spy or a communist, Dr. Xian was deported to China against his will as part of a secret swap for American pilots shot down by the PRC during the Korean War. And ironically, after being forced to return to China, Xian revolutionized the Chinese ballistic missile program and later initiated the design of the Silkworm missile, which was used against the American armed forces during the First Persian Gulf War. This suggests to me that many of the obsessive measures to promote national security tend to produce the opposite effect, especially when immigrant brainpower is being pushed out of this country. And history would repeat itself once again during the third wave of Chinese immigration, which occurred after the U.S. resumed diplomatic relations with the PRC. Business boomed in China, and especially during the Deng Xiaoping years, and tens of thousands of Chinese scholars, as well as people from all classes, came to the U.S. However, as I discuss in my book, the disintegration of the Soviet Empire and the rise of China as the world's second largest superpower, raised concerns that China would soon rival the United States economically, intellectually, militarily. And so simultaneously, it's interesting to note that new legislation was passed to make it difficult for many Chinese immigrants, as well as many other immigrants, to effectively compete with American-born citizens. The Immigration Act of 1990 introduced the H-1B visa program for highly educated and skilled immigrant workers, but it restricted the time that such visa holders could work in the U.S. to a maximum of 6 years. Critics of the program called it white-collar servitude or high-tech coolieism because a disproportionate number of H-1B visa holders were Chinese. And as the 1990s progressed, the U.S. government feared that ethnic Chinese scientists would pass military secrets to the PRC, and I think the most visible example of that would be the Wen-Ho Lee case. And I think that since the past is prologue, we need to look to history to understand how and why the Chinese and other groups face these cycles of persecution and abuse. And I'd like to share with you some of my theories and conclusions. My research suggests that the driving forces behind racism are typically forces that are greater than simply mere physical or cultural differences. Because keep in mind that the appearance of the Chinese, the shape of their eyes, the darkness of their skin, their black hair, didn't offend most white people or bring out their worst xenophobic impulses until certain conditions came into play. And these conditions usually required a political or economic crisis. For example, the exclusion era emerged out of the Depression of the 1870s. The anti-Chinese witch hunts of the McCarthy years of the 50s came immediately after mainland China turned communist, and everyone was obsessed with who lost China. And the most recent backlash against the Chinese in the 1990s, as seen in like the Cox Report and the Wen-Ho Lee case, grew out of U.S. concerns that China would fill the massive power void left by the Russians after the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. And as with the conditions preceding the rape of Nanking or the Holocaust, although to a much lesser degree, politicians in the United States were able to expand their power by scapegoating a minority group. Racism was also routinely exploited as a tool for social control to preserve the position of existing elites, but more significantly, I think, to hamper serious debate and analysis and investigation of the government activities. It was really used as an effective smokescreen. I think it's really easy to see how this can happen, how racial stereotypes can emerge to pretty much cloud people's judgment and also to hide the realities of government power. Because when people's jobs are at stake and when they feel threatened, they are more willing to give up some of their personal freedom for a greater protection by the government. But as history has revealed time and again, the choice to trade liberty for security is usually the most dangerous choice of all. According to the research of R.J. Rummel, who is a world expert on genocide, it's not the genetic makeup of a particular people, nor a particular religion, nationality, or political philosophy that causes people to kill. But the real defining factor is sheer, absolute, unchecked power. The more concentrated the power in the hands of an elite, the more likely that elite, regardless of its race or culture or any other factor, will commit human rights abuses both at home and abroad and initiate war with their neighbors. And according to the empirical data on this subject, dictatorships and totalitarian regimes are by nature, because of their power structure, more likely to wage war on other countries and torture their citizens at home than democratic societies or true democratic societies, because the absolute power that some of these elites have give them the ability to act instantaneously on the dark impulses that lurk within all human beings. And the solution, according to Rommel and many others, is to simply diffuse power through the forces of education and democracy. Grassroots political activism, for example, serves to hold leaders accountable for their actions, and education and public access to government information will enable the masses to make informed decisions about their elected officials. Democracy, therefore, must be championed not as some abstract ideal, but as an actual preventative measure against atrocity. And the Chinese in America were active participants in this process of democracy. And contrary to popular belief, and this really surprised me as I was doing my research, they were never passive victims of injustice. What isn't commonly discussed in history textbooks is that they fought back time and again, using the tactics of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, even before these men existed, a passive resistance, nonviolent protests, petitions, boycotts, and court hearings. There was amazingly little violence that you would expect from a group that had experienced such legal discrimination and even systematic slaughter in some regions. The Chinese in America went to the law, they used the law, and they fought for their rights. For example, just to give you some examples from 19th century history, during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese workers peacefully organized a labor strike against the Central Pacific, I think one of the largest of its kind at the time, demanding higher wages and fewer hours and an end to whippings by the white foremen. And they succeeded in winning a few concessions. The only reason the strike did not last longer than it did was because the Central Pacific cut off their food supply and essentially starved them back to work. In the American South, where post-Civil War plantation owners had toyed with the idea of replacing black slavery with Chinese labor, the Chinese hired interpreters to negotiate their contracts and sued their employers if they violated them. The Chinese also sued white schools in California and elsewhere that refused to admit their children. They also helped organize boycotts in China itself of American products to demand better treatment of Chinese immigrants by American authorities. And they also pooled their resources together to hire the best white lawyers and lobbyists of the day to kind of work the system and overturn anti-Chinese laws. It was a struggle that would lay down the foundation of civil rights law to the benefit of human rights activists decades later. For example, Yickwo versus Hopkins set the standard for equal protection before the law, that any law applied in a discriminatory manner, whether to U.S. citizens or foreign aliens, is unconstitutional. And the landmark case Wong Kim Ark versus U.S. upheld the principle of birthright citizenship, which would prevent American-born non-white people from being stripped of their citizenship and relegated into a foreign permanent underclass, which is often the case in other countries, where your citizenship is not really determined by whether you were born in the country, but the status of your parents and their parents. Many of these anti-Chinese laws that I had discussed in my book disappeared entirely, after World War II, especially because of the more favorable conditions the Chinese found themselves in during the war. But the Chinese continue to remain politically active. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Chinese-American students staged sit-ins and demonstrations that forced universities such as San Francisco State and Berkeley to establish ethnic studies departments. And since the 1980s, Chinese-Americans have held huge rallies and raised legal funds to fight hate crimes, such as the brutal murders of Vincent Chin and Jim Liu. Chinese scientists also organized a very successful boycott of the national labs in recent years after the U.S. government engaged in illegal racial profiling tactics in the Wenho Lee case. Many of the legal protections and rights that we Americans take for granted today are the direct result of countless lawsuits filed by the early Chinese in the United States. But I'm afraid that the gains of a century and a half of activism are rapidly being wiped out, often within a matter of months. The USA Patriot Act of year 2001 and its sequel, the proposed Domestic Security Enhancement Act of 2003, threaten to destroy many of our hard-won American rights, such as our right to habeas corpus hearings, or even our right to retain our U.S. citizenship. U.S. officials are also evoking some of the most shameful legislation from the past to justify present policies in the name of security. A few months ago, Representative Howard Coble, who is also the head of Homeland Security Subcommittee, shocked the Asian American community by defending the imprisonment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s. He said, and I'll quote him directly, "Some probably were intent on doing harm to us, just as some of these Arab Americans are probably intent on doing harm to us." And as you all know, the Middle Eastern ethnic community has suffered great persecution since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, in a manner reminiscent of the persecution of the Chinese American community during the McCarthy era and the exclusion era. People have been ordered off airplanes, and they've been harassed and even killed. There have been detentions without court hearings and deportations, and according to some of the human rights attorneys who are representing the needs of that community in the San Francisco Bay Area, some families are actually fleeing from the United States as refugees into Canada. This should not continue. You must leave options open for immigrants. You cannot cut them off from the law. I think that when a country does that, a country is asking for outrage and mayhem and the flight of the best immigrant talent from that country. And people need to recognize this not as an ethnic issue, but as a human rights issue. The dangers of racial profiling, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, is that the government can use a divide and conquer strategy, suspending the rights of various groups one at a time until everyone suffers in the end. And as long as any group is being scapegoated in America merely on the basis of its cultural heritage, none of us are safe. And the book that I have just written, The Chinese in America, may be considered an ethnic book, but I believe it contains universal themes about human nature that transcend ethnicity. And the message that comes across all of these stories is very clear. We cannot leave the difficult business of democracy mainly or solely in the hands of our elected officials. I don't believe that governments alone will relinquish or share power unless people force them to. And significant social change rarely occurs from the top down, rather it percolates from the bottom up. So groups of all different races need to work together and form coalitions and engage in dialogue and reach out to other people, not turn within themselves. To be effective champions of democracy, all of us have to be willing to make sacrifices and to be much more aggressive and proactive in crossing color and race lines. It means talking regularly to our elected officials, educating them about our lives, holding them accountable for their actions, writing op-eds, going to public protests when needed, networking with a wide circle of people, ranging from the victims and even the perpetrators of hate crimes, because I think to understand the cause of their behavior is to take the first step to prevent them. I mean, sometimes the most effective way, I believe, to resolve conflict or to prevent them from happening in the first place is to simply listen to other people and understand their point of view, which are really the crucial and necessary steps if you're even going to attempt a dialogue. And I think that since we're in this all together as Americans, I want this book to be viewed not simply as an ethnic Chinese story, but a quintessential American one. My personal identity as a Chinese American derives its force from my rights and my duties and my obligations as a Chinese citizen. And the struggle to uphold American democracy, the struggle to protect the human rights and civil liberties of all Americans, not just Chinese Americans, is an ongoing struggle for all of us and our descendants and their descendants, rather than a job that it's already finished and done. If there's just one message I'd like to get across to my readers, it's that democracy is and was never a guarantee. It's still very, very much a young and fragile experiment. Thank you so much for your time.
talk is going to be seen on WGBH. They will be web streaming it, and if you don't speak into here, people can never make sense of the answer if they don't know what the question is. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. The first one's always the bravest.
Hi, I actually heard you speak last weekend at the Committee of 100 conference, and I want to say that I really enjoyed hearing you speak and a lot of the messages that you have to get across.
Thank you.
And one question I have in particular is that to kind of group individuals from a country as Chinese Americans, on one hand, like they have many similar experiences, but on the other hand, like there's always a class divide. And I know that you kind of brought that up with like the Chinese laborers, and some of them were capitalists, as well as later some of them were scholars, and then some of them were not. And so I kind of was wondering how, both in your book and just kind of your general ideas of, in your research, how you feel that like Chinese Americans or any ethnic group bridges that class divide while working together as a group.
I think it means just it's going to require a lot of work, and I don't think it should be left up just to groups. I think people individually have to take the step to break out of their lifestyles and interact with people that they normally wouldn't think of talking with. I feel that, I mean, you're absolutely correct that the class divide that's discussed in my book from the earliest days of the Chinatowns are still very much present today. It may even be worse now because there are many people here in this country who are illegal aliens, and so they don't have the rights and the protections that many Americans would have. And I believe that there are many ways of going about this. One way is to simply to work with some of the existing organizations that are already representing some of the specific needs for the groups, and to perhaps even organize conferences or town hall forums to talk about this, but maybe on an even simpler level, simply to spend time volunteering in communities that normally wouldn't have visitors from people outside of those neighborhoods. And it's often not easy because there can be often a sense of distrust, and this is true for just about any group, and it's our natural tendency often to simply to fall into a particular groove in our lifestyle and not step out of that.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Thank you very much for your wonderfully simple, concise overview of 150 years of Chinese in America. I had a question. You brought up the political science literature on sort of democracies and totalitarian governments and the tendencies towards war, and it wasn't quite clear how that tied into the issue of racism within a country. Democratic countries are less likely to go to war against other democratic countries, but it seemed like the bulk of your talk was really internal, domestic, racial issues, at least within America.
What I just wanted to point out is that sometimes in a time of economic or political instability, politicians will expand their power and make a power grab, often by exploiting people's fears. And the best way to exploit people's fears is to find an enemy, either overseas or one at home, an enemy that may be, in pretty much an enemy that might be a racial, ethnic minority, but has been stereotyped as being perpetually foreign and not really somebody who is like the natives in that country. And the reason why I bring this up is because then racial stereotyping then becomes a tool, a political tool, for these groups to expand their power. And it also makes it very difficult for people to have a reasonable discussion or to even talk rationally about these issues, because it's what clouds the discussion are racial stereotypes and the dehumanization of people into these things, which then could later make it easier for the group to destroy them because they're not really people. So I just wanted people to be cognizant of these kinds of trends we see this happening in other countries. I mean, it was definitely present, in Japan before the rape of Nanking. You see it in other acts of genocide in other countries. But even in the United States, we've had these kinds of patterns as well.
Yeah, what's your opinion of the other book that takes, I guess, a different tact? It's something along the lines of the alleged rape of Nanking. And what's your critique of it?
Well, which one? Because there have been several, and actually a lot of them have come out of Japan.
Can you do an overview of them quickly, concisely?
Yes, I certainly can, but actually, just to summarize, after the rape of Nanking was published, I think I was the subject of a large backlash from ultranationalists in Japan, and there have been, entire books written that have been attempting to discredit my research or just to attack me personally, and they, their titles are sometimes the alleged, rape of Nanking. In fact, there have also been in Japan conferences organized by academics, often on government property, with the title of just saying why the rape of Nanking is just the biggest lie of the 20th century. It's very sad to see because Japan as a country has not dealt with its wartime issues to the same degree as Germany had after the Holocaust. And the rape of Nanking discusses the reasons for this, that the Cold War politics made it easier for the United States to protect Japan and to kind of view them as a base from which to counter communism. And so a lot of the war criminals were not prosecuted, and in fact were elevated into high positions, and to this day reparations have not been paid. And I think worst of all, the reality of many of the atrocities, such as the rape of Nanking, but also others like the Comfort Women's System, the Unit 731, they're not being taught effectively in Japanese schools. The Ministry of Education has been systematically censoring this information for decades, and it's been the subject of great legal battles within Japan by progressive Japanese who are trying to ensure that young children learn the realities of World War II. And the upshot is that to this day there are many Japanese students who don't really know that the U.S. and Japan were even at war, and and also the Japanese war criminals are being worshipped as gods in the Yasukuni Shrine to this day, which is some people have considered like the moral equivalent of moving busts of Hitler into the biggest cathedral in Berlin and worshiping them as deities. So, I discuss all of this in my book and how a lot of the historians who've written about this in Japan have had, they've actually been they've received death threats. They've, Honda Katsuchi, who's written a book on the Nanking Massacre, has to go out often, wearing sunglasses and wigs because of the assaults on his all the threats that have been made to him by ultranationalists over the years. It's been going on for more than 20 years. And so when the rape of Nanking came out, there was just the same groups that were terrorizing him were making a great deal of noise about this book as well.
I'm curious to know how you arrived at the title, The Chinese in America, as opposed to maybe something like The Americans Who Came from China, or something to that effect.
The reason I use the title, The Chinese in America, is because it includes the experience of ethnic Chinese who are not American citizens. And I thought about it too. I was thinking, well, would this not perpetuate, the stereotype that we are all foreigners? But I finally just decided that it was probably just the easiest way to describe the content of this book. When I say the Chinese in America, I refer to the Chinese immigrants who came here, many of whom never became citizens, and their descendants and as well, and who are all American.
I was sitting in a class discussion of Elie Wiesel's, one of the most outspoken survivors of Holocaust, and it was a discussion about the book of the rape of Nanking. And to non-Asian students in the class, it never occurred to them that such a thing happened, or it never caught their attention. Mm-hmm. And Elie Wiesel himself was obviously quite stricken by what he read from the book. Mm-hmm. Well, given that the atrocities and rape of Nanking is perhaps no less than that of the Holocaust in terms of its scale and the degree of cruelty, yet in Western world today, the public awareness of the rape of Nanking compared with that of the Holocaust is still infinitesimal. Can you discuss some main reasons behind that?
I would say that the first and greatest reason is merely its demographic. Just in sheer numbers, this country has more of a European heritage than an Asian heritage. So I think it would be natural, perhaps even inevitable, that many Americans would be more fixated on the history of World War II in Europe than the World War II in Asia. There may even be relatives who are directly, affected by this. But I think that this may be changing because now there's large-scale immigration from Asia, and the racial complexion of this country is changing through interracial marriage, through the new arrivals. And it's interesting that along with these newcomers, we're seeing a lot more interest now in the subject of the Pacific Holocaust of World War II. But it is a recent development, just as the large-scale immigration from Asia is a recent development. It wasn't until the 1960s that many of the racist quotas that kept the numbers of immigrants small were pretty much replaced by legislation introduced under Lyndon Johnson. So that's one reason, I think. And the second reason is, as I mentioned before, Cold War politics. And there was actually a concerted effort among many American high-level officials to keep the subject under wraps, because some of the data that was collected by the Japanese doctors as they committed these medical atrocities were later then given to American government authorities in exchange for exonerating the Japanese doctors for their crimes. I mean, we're talking about, freezing people to death, exposing them to plague, dissecting them alive without anesthesia. And apparently the United States government was very interested in knowing, the results, lab results of this, because of its possible exploitation in biological warfare. I mean, we don't really know how the data was used. We just simply know that there were these high-level negotiations, and as a result, some of the Japanese doctors went on and became powerful executives, and, or professors, or they ran an organization called the Green Cross Blood Processing plant, which eventually had to shut down because they were selling HIV-tainted blood to hemophiliac patients. I mean, it was shocking in Japan, but not so shocking when you consider the resumes of the people in charge. So, and what's very upsetting is that to this day, the extent of this complicity between the U.S. and Japan is still not revealed, in a lot of government documents. Shortly after this book came out, and there have been other books about biological warfare, there was a push to declassify the remaining Japanese documents in U.S. custody from World War II. There was legislation to do so for the Nazi war crimes records, and so then the Japanese Imperial Government Disclosure Act was passed under Clinton before he left office, and before it was finally signed off into law, there was some kind of provision introduced that would make it possible for intelligence committees to remove material from those records that were deemed dangerous to national security. And there was a great deal of discussion about it at the time. And a lot of people are saying, why would you have this particular provision? It doesn't exist for the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. And so there's still a double standard, and you really do wonder what they're trying to hide. And so I think the only way to fight against that is for people to write to their elected officials or to talk to them and to really place pressure on them to expose this information. Without that, we don't have as effective of a democracy as we can, because obviously, as I said, the antidotes to atrocities, democracy and education, anything that would diffuse power. And, government access to government information is central to preserving democracy. There was a Japanese a company that publisher that tried to translate the book, and then they had to cancel the contract. And the rumor was that there were, well, according to the Japanese media, they had received threats from ultranationalists. Any of you who are interested in this can find an article about this in the New York Times. They interviewed me. They interviewed the publisher. It was a really terrible situation. I could write an entire book about the response to this book, and I may well do so, because the story of the movement to bring redress to the victims of these atrocities, or at least just to gain as much information as possible, and a lot of documents have been released, is a worthy subject of exploration. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. And first, I would like to express my personal thanks to you, because I finished my PhD at Harvard 2 years ago, and your book on Qian Xuesheng is one of the reference books of my dissertation.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much. And here I would like to make a comment, which itself is also a question. I would like to listen to your opinions. While advocating briefly and the basic rights, the human rights of American Chinese, seemingly you didn't emphasize the Chinese culture, which reminds me of the mini-series on TV, on PBS I watched, Becoming American.
Yes, Bill Moyer's PBS documentary.
Yeah, yes, about 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's good to hear the voice of Chinese Americans, but that show worries me a little bit, or very much worried me, because I see while fighting for their basic rights for the citizenships, they are losing or trying to lose their cultural identities. They want to people forget they are Chinese. They want to people regard them the same as everyone. So that's part of the reason why Chinese Americans are not brave enough. That they usually don't united and fight together against the discriminations against them, because they don't have the confidence on their culture, especially the second generation or even third generation. They don't speak Chinese. They don't like to speak Chinese even. So when their parents try to speak Chinese to them, they have some rebelling or whatever. They have no interest to keep Chinese culture. That's a big mistake also.
If I might say, so in other words, you're very concerned about the price that we would pay for assimilation, the loss of Chinese culture, and you're claiming that because of this that we're turning our back, or the Chinese Americans are turning their back on the culture, which is not something I think a lot of people would agree with, that by doing that they are also not unified in a way that would protect their rights. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
How could you possibly?
Well, if I might say something, I, and this is my personal opinion, maybe a lot of people don't agree with me, but I believe that it is possible to embrace your cultural heritage and also to defend American democracy, that you don't really have to choose one or the other, and that the degree to which you choose to embrace a cultural heritage or a historical heritage is really an individual decision. you raise an interesting point, because what you were saying is precisely what many Chinese Americans, especially immigrant parents, would complain about, and not just now, but like as early as the 20s or the 19th century. They'll say our children, they're forgetting what it means to be Chinese. And they were very concerned about it. They would send their children to Chinese school, which a lot of them loathed, and and they felt so frightened that they would forget, that they came from this great ancient culture of 5,000 years, and that they would forget this rich cultural heritage. And while I admired the parents' determination to teach their children about their heritage, because I think that we all need to learn from history in order to prevent ourselves from making the same mistakes, I also would like to stress that what we consider to be culture, though, or Chinese culture, that's often subject to interpretation, and it's constantly the culture itself is constantly changing and shifting, and that's why it's a little, when we have discussions about somebody's too Chinese or not Chinese enough, it's often very difficult to define exactly what that is. And I guess if there's one point I want to make is that the lines between groups, whether national lines, racial lines, ethnic lines, cultural lines, they're constantly shifting and blurring, and it's very hard to sometimes to try to keep those lines constant. A war can redraw the map instantly, and the reality is life is just filled with change, and the only one constant that I think we should really adhere to is the preservation, protecting everybody's individual human rights, and also preserving education so we understand where we came from. But there is a danger to sometimes to holding on to a certain mindset that this is the way everyone in the group has to behave, because many of the Chinese who came here, they would tell their children, you must one day go back to China, and in China people did this and that. But what they didn't realize was that the China that was in their head no longer existed 40 years later. That even some of the people who have tried to go back found themselves almost like in a foreign country in itself. In fact, I didn't have a chance to go into as much detail on this as I would have liked, just because it was very, very difficult, to continue to sustain the narrative. But there was a family that had gone to Idaho City, and they were very prosperous there. The father, this was in the 1800s, and the patriarch kind of uprooted his whole family and tried to send them back to China. But the China that they were entering was a very different China that this 80-year-old man had known as a youth. And he died shortly after he got there, but the rest of the family was stuck there. And then they couldn't get back because of the exclusion laws. And then after one decade or another, it was just they were kind of caught up in World War II. They were just stuck there. Then the Cultural Revolution. And for years, they would sometimes talk about going back to America. And they had a vision of America which was trapped in the way Idaho City was at the time. And just as the great-grandfather who had gone to Idaho City had this fantasy of what China was like, which no longer even existed. That you can't go home again is the point I'm trying to make. And so many years later, one of the descendants met somebody who I guess came from the vicinity of Idaho City and said, oh, Idaho City, that's a great city with a big bank, and it's like and he was just thinking in terms of the gold rush time. He said, no, Idaho City is a ghost town. The only reason I bring this up is because it's what we consider to be culture is often just it's a certain image that we have in our minds, but it may not necessarily even be relevant to what's happening today.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the distinction between ethnic/cultural identity and political identity, if it's even fair to try and make that distinction. But I do raise it because I think in cases where racism or discrimination is applied, people are creating that distinction in their minds. For instance, I think it's safe to say that there are ethnic Chinese communities in countries almost all over the world. And for some reason, I think more so compared with many other ethnic minorities or migrant communities in those countries, there is this perception that ethnic Chinese communities, culturally distinct or assimilated, are more likely to return their political loyalties to mainland China than you would expect, say, of, African Americans to Africa, of, whatever, just Spanish Americans to Spain or something like that.
Perception in this
There
country.
is that perception, and I see it, not just in the United States, in the Wen-Ho Lee case, for instance, but in Southeast Asia, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, almost everywhere. And it's very curious because this issue, touching again on this question of cultural assimilation, whether generations have existed in that country, whether a person is third generation or whether they've just gotten there, regardless of their class, there is still this perpetual foreigner perception. And I wonder if you could talk about what your research has told you, whether it's because of the size and the potential political and economic might of China, if it's something that's unique to the way Chinese culture is perceived, or so on.
I think you've raised some very interesting questions that deserve more research. I found the whole subject of the Chinese diaspora to be intriguing as well, and the fact that sometimes there are these communities, especially in Southeast Asia, that are very much, ethnically Chinese and have been for generations. And I haven't explored this thoroughly, but I'm interested in to what degree this is a personal choice on the part of the ethnic Chinese who go there, or to what degree it's a reaction to the perception of them as perpetual foreigners by the mainstream population. But one thing that we should keep in mind is that I think that the Chinese are known to be one of the great middlemen minorities in the world. I think that this diaspora is linked to a phenomenon that is actually shared by some other ethnic groups. The most, I think the biggest middlemen minority groups include the Chinese, the Jews, the Armenians, and the Lebanese. And typically what happens is that these ethnic groups, when they migrate to another country, they kind of adopt certain economic patterns. They'll find economic niches and fill them, and often bring a capitalistic role into societies that are often feudal in mindset. And so what they'll often do is they'll serve as a crucial middleman between producers and consumers as agents, as like labor recruiters, as retailers and as merchants. And what typically happens is that they often achieve great economic success in those host countries, but not a great deal of political power, and so they're very vulnerable, because even though they are involved in often creating entire economies, the host population, whether it's upper class or if it's the people of the bottom society, often view them with great suspicion, and when things go wrong economically, or when there's a political crisis, then they're scapegoated. And so in precisely those countries where the middlemen minorities are most economically successful, they're also the ones who face the biggest backlash, and face pogroms. And as you know, the Chinese have experienced this in Indonesia, just in recent years. And they have more power economically in Southeast Asia than they even do in the U.S. I think almost all of the billionaires in Southeast Asia are ethnic Chinese, and so it's an interesting phenomenon, really. And I think that this whole subject really deserves a lot of exploration, because it doesn't just involve the Chinese; it involves other groups, and they say the Jews are also like one of the most prominent middlemen minority groups, and they have repeatedly suffered, persecution because of this role. Oh, okay.
No?
Okay. Thank you for writing those wonderful books.
Thank you.
In particular, The Rape of Nanking. I think I truly believe what Japanese did in China during the World War II. I think most of the Chinese, from mainland China, all believe what Japanese did. During the World War II. This is a lot taught by, told by the Communist Party. We are told by our parents, our grandparents, who witnessed the war and who experienced the ordeal during the wartime. So I think this is a truth. My question here probably not appropriate, but I really want to ask you, what's your view about Japan right now? Do you still think Japan is a threat to the Asian country, given the fact that Japan has never, formally apologized for what they did during the war, in my knowledge?
Well, I'm disturbed by what I see as the rising ultranationalism in Japan. And I just think it's going to be harmful, most of all to the people within that society, because I can't tell you how many people within Japan, who've migrated to the United States, have told me about their frustration in dealing with the power structure within Japan, how people don't really have a way of changing the system, or they believe that there is no way, that there's kind of an oligarchy in place. It's not a true democracy, that they cannot get their voices expressed in the media. And I always, encourage them to engage in grassroots activism and to speak out, because ultimately you get the government that you deserve. And I sympathize with many of them. And what part of the problem is that the United States government never dismantled the infrastructure of government that was in place during the war, and which many Japanese wanted dismantled. But the emperor was never prosecuted as a war criminal, so that the monarchy was permitted to remain intact. And so, a great deal of the blame, I think, needs to rest not only on Japan but also the United States. It's very unfortunate. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm a student here at the Ed School, and I just had a question about, you talked about especially the feelings for, immigrant populations, and I know it's very much within Latinos and Asian American immigration into California, where I'm from. And so what do you see as being the larger problem between those communities which perceive great differences between each other? And there are differences, but are there what alliances are there being made or not, or
in other words, you're interested in knowing what kind of coalition building is taking place now between the Chinese, the Hispanics, and other ethnic groups. There have been some alliances made. There should be a lot more. Certainly, it may be of interest to you to know that in the 1960s, actually, the Chinese American and other Asian American students joined forces with Hispanic Americans, Native American Indians, also African Americans to protest on campuses against the lack of awareness or curriculums teaching their history. So that's how the ethnic studies departments came to be. That they didn't happen spontaneously. It really resulted it came about as a result of great pressure from these students with sit-ins and shutdowns of campuses. They went on strike. Since then, there have been other alliances. They usually emerge out of mutual need. I know the Japanese American community right now is extremely concerned about the mistreatment of Middle Eastern immigrants now, and because they're concerned that the legislation that was used to intern the Japanese Americans will be used to intern the, Middle Eastern immigrants. I mean, apparently this law, Karamatsu versus U.S., is still on the books. It's a deep concern to the Japanese American community. So that's another example of an alliance. But I think there needs to be a lot more. And I think you're in an ideal situation being in a university setting where I think it's easier to host conferences and to create these networks than people who are busy, professionals and time-starved professionals. So I really encourage all of you to start that dialogue, by talking to people both on campus and across campuses.
I have two questions. The first one is, I wonder whether you can comment or make some point of view about books previously published on this topic about Rape of Nanking. And I believe one of them is actually named the same title. Some of the documents were smuggled out of Nanjing during the Second World War by either British or American correspondents. So I wonder whether there is any connection or anything new or different. I'm sure there are, so I want to hear from
Are you referring to this book that came out very shortly after the war?
It is also named The Rape of Nanking, I believe.
There was another book called The Rape of Nanking that came out maybe shortly before mine did. It's a big picture book. Is that the one we're referring to by Shi Young and James Yin?
No.
But is this in Chinese? Because it could very well be books there are several books in the Chinese language called The Rape of Nanking.
The one particularly talk about is the material is based on these documents that was smuggled out of Nanjing by American citizen, and the documents were actually recorded by Australian correspondent working at that time for the Manchester Guard, I believe. But
Timperley's papers.
Exactly.
There's actually a lot of records out there. There's at Yale Divinity School Library, they have probably the largest missionary collection a collection of missionary diaries on the massacre. I mean, that's where a lot of these testimonials came from. The National Archives has, Foreign Office intercepts, the U.S. government's intercepts and deciphering of Japanese secret messages. Navy records, State Department records. So there's just it's a treasure trove of information. I was really surprised by how much there was. And in Germany, later I had contacted the family that kept the diaries of John Rabe, which was the Nazi that was active in saving lives. There's also records in England, Japan. There were a number of foreign correspondents there, and of course thousands of documents in the archives in China. So there's a tremendous amount of information there, and still people who are alive to testify about it. And I filmed some of them, and some of them are being systematically filmed. But the one you're talking about, I think you're maybe referring to something that was published shortly after the war, and it was not called The Rape of Nanking. It had another title though.
Yeah, I think that's the one.
Or maybe it was called The Documents of the Safety Zone.
Another question I had is, because I read the book, it's called the Nanjing or Nanking Massacre when I was in China, and I was in middle school, and reading that book was a mistake because the image is just terrible. So I wonder whether it's very difficult to write that book, and as for the book, The Chinese in America, probably you can more identify with people and story in that book. So, which one is more difficult for you to write? If that's
both books had posed their own challenges. I would say that The Rape of Nanking was the most difficult book to write emotionally for me. I mean, I suffered physical repercussions as a result of writing it. I mean, I lost weight. A lot of hair fell out at the time. You can't write about something like this without suffering some personal toll. I mean, even without the backlash. But at the same time, I felt compelled to write it because the idea that hundreds of thousands of people could be slaughtered in this manner and that the world would kind of just move on and forget that they even existed was galling to me, and made me concerned that perhaps something in the future could happen to us, and that the idea that we would just kind of fade into oblivion was frightening. And I felt that I didn't think it was going to be a bestseller. I just wanted to write it so that historians and scholars or any interested individuals would be able to find it in the public libraries. This book is very different in that while The Rape of Nanking was a very focused subject, this is an extremely broad epic history, and I had to wrestle a narrative from that. So while this was a work of exploration, this was a work of great synthesis and compression and deciding what not to put in, whereas this I was constantly discovering new documents and new people who were coming out and talking about the story, survivor testimonials. So it was different. This was not as emotional or psychologically difficult to write. It was fascinating for me, but I don't think I suffered any kind of psychological toll from it. So, and in fact, to be honest, made me quite proud to know that many Chinese Americans were firmly engaged in civil rights activism right at the beginning. And I came to realize that this was truly an American story.
Iris, I just really want to thank you for being here today. I have to say that we do probably about 40 forums a year, and I'm always struck by who comes. I mean, the question before I get here is who will be there today. And I'm always surprised at the insularity that we have in institutions of higher education. There was a question that was raised by one of our technicians, yes, and it really struck me that we tend to fall into slim little categories of what our interest areas are. And I now wish that your book had been entitled The Chinese in America and What It Means for Human Rights and sort of all ethnic groups, because in fact it seems we need more expansive titles in order to pull in the larger audiences that need to be reading these books so that we see the common identification and the common issues rather than
I agree.
The small categories.
So that might be a subject for a future book.
Well, I hope it will be, because I think you've touched on some issues today that are, you've touched on very specific historic area, which is just compelling and extraordinary, and which I promise to read immediately. But I think you've also touched on some really larger issues that need champions that come together. Every time Elie Wiesel speaks, it's a room full of Jews. And, when you speak, we've never had so many Chinese in the audience. And, we cannot begin to understand the complexity of the world we live in if we continue to travel in packs in this way.
That's right, and I mentioned that we shouldn't look at race just as these immutable blocks of humanity, because the reality is it's more like a spectrum of color where one line kind of blurs into the next, and the important thing is to really look at the individual human story behind.
Well, I think you're
all of these experiences.
a great future voice, and I hope you keep writing and championing these issues. We look forward to it. Thank you so much for being here.
And it's an honor to be here. Thank you.